Today, we are going to ask the question, why did the new movie adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot fail? I caught it on streaming, and today I want to break it down in this film analysis. An analysis that will explore why the movie itself did not work as I hoped it would, but also why there are other factors surrounding it that allowed it to fail in the first place. So with that being said, welcome to my channel, Film Obsessed, where I talk about everything that I love and enjoy in the world of movies and television. I usually tend to want to talk about the things that I enjoy primarily, more than anything else, but sometimes there is something that I do want to speak to that may not have been what I wanted it to be. Today's example is the movie Salem's Lot, HBO Max's newest movie streaming release. A movie that, I might add, I actually wasn't planning to see originally, but because it does have the Stephen King name attached to it, I felt more inclined to want to give it a watch. We are talking about the adaptation of a book from one of the most acclaimed authors in history, and arguably maybe the biggest horror book author ever. This man has written some of the most insane things ever put to the page. If you don't believe me, go give his book It a read, and you'll find out just how twisted of a mind that this dude has. Salem's Lot is a book he wrote about one of the more iconic horror characters ever, with vampires. So in your mind, you're probably thinking, what could possibly have gone wrong? Well, that's what we have here with this adaptation, and that gets me to talking about the first reason for why this movie failed, which is around the mishandling of it from the studios. The movie was announced back in 2019, 5 years ago, but only found its actual director until a year later, with them only then going and finding their main lead, Lewis Pullman, another year later in 2021, before they officially started shooting the movie, which wrapped shooting in 2022 with an original release date set for September of that year. While there is a caveat to the notion that this movie was a product of the COVID era, it was also a movie that succumbed to a change within the streaming era, specifically with the company that it was under, which is Warner Brothers, who owns HBO Max, or as it's now stupidly called, Max. Both companies during this time were undergoing changes with regards to leadership and strategy. David Zaslav, the now CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, was hired in 2021. The years that followed his hiring turned to when the general public started to look down on Warner Brothers as a company with a lot of the decisions they were making, specifically with how they handled certain films being written off and canceled for tax write-ups, the name change that he was involved in with his streaming service of HBO Max to just Max, or even, for examples, with the one we are talking about today, where they put movies like Salem's Lot on streaming instead of in theaters. They waited 2 years to let people know that this movie still existed, even though they had finished filming it back in 2022, and what makes this mishandling of the movie even more apparent is that at the time when they originally wanted to release it, this is when we actually started to see movie theaters come back to life. 2022 was a massive year at the box office, with your big-scale blockbusters raking in billions, to even seeing several horror movies be within the top 30 or so films that did well at the box office in general in theaters. I think that it was a massive mistake on Warner Brothers' part to not at least try and put this movie in theaters in that year, or at least within next year of 2023 at some point. We are talking about a studio that is known for putting out some of the scariest horror movies of the modern era, with stuff like the Conjuring movies, the It movies, which are another Stephen King adaptation, and so on. If they put a good enough marketing campaign together to promote this film based off all the aspects around it, I think that they could have had something decent at best on their hands. Let's also factor in another point that makes this very apparent, and that is the budget of this movie, which is not officially being reported on as far as what I could find, but if I had to take a guess, I'd say that it probably cost no more than $50 million to make. With how long the movie is and how they utilized location shooting and emphasis on sometimes using practical effects, it doesn't look like it cost a lot to make. So with that being said, you probably could have just released it in theaters and promoted it well enough to where it could have done well. In this case, this is actually now a good way to transition over to actually talking about the movie itself in another way of which it was mishandled, which comes down to the quality. Now, my honest thoughts about this movie are that I was not as pleased with it as I was hoping I would be. It is a very average movie by the standards of what it could have been. It does some things that I liked, but it also does some things that I wasn't particularly a fan of with the filmmaking, and especially when you consider the genre that it's in with horror. The first big issue that this movie has is that it does not feel like it should have been made as a movie. It became very apparent throughout my watch of it that the way it was edited and cut made it feel like they had originally planned to turn it into a limited series show, and what makes this point interesting is that that's actually the way the very first original adaptation of the book was done back in 1979, with the TV miniseries. Full disclosure, I have not seen that version, so I'm not going to be making any comparisons, but just based off a few of the clips that I have seen of that adaptation, it looked like it was adapting the book in a much better way than the movie was. The way that the movie transitions through scenes makes it feel like there are details missing that you were supposed to have before going from scene to scene. There are time jumps and continuity errors that are completely missing from what I feel like I should have known before certain big events happen with our main characters as they take on this growing vampire horde that is infesting the town of Salem's Lot. It is a slow build-up to the end of the movie where you see that this entire town basically gets taken over by these vampires, and the main one, which this franchise is known for, in Kurt Barlow. The image of this vampire from the original miniseries is an iconic one to say the least, and I admit, I think that that version was actually more terrifying than the one in the movie version, but that's just my personal opinion. He shows up in spurts, and I personally never felt as big of an attachment to that character for being the main vampire of this conflict. Even with some of our main characters, I didn't feel as much of an attachment to them either, because it felt like the movie was trying to rush through this extensive book, which, as I can gather, is longer than around 400 pages. Given the movie is only just less than 2 hours, that would mean that it could only try and cover about half that book, give or take. The way that the rule of it works in filmmaking is that, generally speaking, 1 minute of screen time is 1 page of a screenplay. So with that being said, I can imagine that there are good chunks of the book that are missing within the movie that would only have helped it. A book that, might I add, people have said they regard as one of his top 10 best works with what he has written. This in a way kind of gets to my next point, which is around the notion of HBO Max and Warner Brothers not giving this book and Stephen King himself the respect he deserved when adapting it. I do not think that it was the smart idea to turn this into a movie, especially when you have an example to show in the past that a miniseries made it somewhat better. I think a limited series adaptation of this book into 1 season of television could have made it way more impactful. With someone like Stephen King and his works, I think that that is something you always have to consider. Based off so many of the things I've heard book readers say about his stories is that the central thing he focuses on is developing characters well enough to where you can get attached to them, but ultimately you know that you are going to lose those characters in the end. That's how a lot of his books go, and in particular, that is what happens in Salem's Lot. The idea behind the book is that it's not just a vampire story. It is a story about these characters in this small town who have to have a good relationship with each other, and when the town gets infested by this vampire plague, it makes it harder on some of our characters to deal with trying to kill them because they know the people who got turned are the ones that they knew. It is an idea about what it means to leave behind what you can't control anymore, even though you still see what you once knew. Say a loved one, for example, or a girlfriend, in the case of our 2 main characters, played by Lewis Pullman and Makenzie Leigh. She gets turned at the end of the movie, and Pullman's character Ben struggles at times to accept the fact that she is gone, but in the end, he has to do the deed of killing her. This is why I say I didn't get as attached to this happening, because I didn't have enough time to soak in the relationships. For example, let's look at another recent Stephen King adaptation that I just watched for the first time as of me making this video, which is 2023's The Boogeyman from 20th Century Studios. Now, granted, this is based off a short story from King and not an actual full-on book, but this movie at least adapted it into a much better way to where there was a heavy focus on characters, and it didn't feel the need to cut everything up in the editing booth to fit a certain way that they wanted to make it out of. I don't think that this movie was perfect by any means or one of the better Stephen King adaptations I've ever seen, but I definitely got something out of it because of what it was focusing on. It is a movie that is more than just a monster movie. There are also a lot of allegorical themes to it, with the idea of what it means to be afraid of the dark, or the hypothetical monsters under your bed or in the closet, or to be afraid of speaking to somebody about pain and loss. It uses those themes to help craft the characters in the movie, and in the end, I almost got a little emotional with what the movie's ending was. A lot of the monster stuff within it kind of came secondary to that, which made the primary stuff much more impactful. And when we compare it, I think it was the vice versa effect with Salem's Lot, where you don't get enough of the character development, and so when the vampires show up on screen, you don't feel as much for when people die, and you don't even get that powerful of a presence with a guy like Kurt Barlow, who is that main vampire. When it comes to some of my final thoughts about Salem's Lot, I think even some of the other things it suffered from were the ending, where it felt very compressed and small for the idea of what it meant for our main characters to win. They basically killed the entire town who turned into vampires, but I never got a sense to that based off the scale of how many they were killing, especially when you factor in the population of the town, which is just above 1,200 people. Something else this movie also suffers from that I think is very lost within the horror genre today is the lighting. I don't think that that this movie was particularly well lit in many scenes where it should have been. That's not to say that the whole movie is poorly lit, because there are some good scenes where it is, but for the majority of it, it felt a little bit more artificial in its lighting as opposed to using real lighting to mask how much more terrifying scenes could have been. A great example to showcase this is with a filmmaker like Robert Eggers, who I think is one of the top 3 best working horror directors today. The way that this guy uses lighting in his movies makes it even more scary, and coincidentally, he is also making a vampire movie that's coming out soon that looks very well lit to make it so that when we see Count Orlok, you are glued to the screen, terrified at his presence, even when his face is not being shown. That is not to say that Gary Dauberman, who is the director of Salem's Lot, didn't do a good job. He's done some decent work in the past with other horror franchises, but I think that this one was not as good as some of his stuff in the past that he's made. At the end of the day, this all goes to show why the new Salem's Lot movie failed, and when it could have been something much better. So there you have it, my film analysis of the new Stephen King adaptation, Salem's Lot. What did you all think? Leave your comments down below on what you think about the movie and my analysis of it. Thank you all for stopping by my channel, Film Obsessed. If you want to see more moving forward for me with regards to film and television, and you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe if you are new here, and turn on that notification bell. I'm trying to build a film community on here, and your support would be greatly appreciated. That's a wrap, folks. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and I will see you all soon for the next video.